right, so here we are getting underway. Today's guest we have is probably one of the ones I have to say I'm most excited in this first couple of episodes that we've had to bring onto the show. Philip, if you would be so kind, it would be wonderful for you to introduce yourself, and then we're just going to dive right into it because I think there's a lot to unpack today.
Cool. Yeah. Hi. Very nice to meet you, and thanks for the invite. My name is Philipp. I'm a journalist. I've been a China correspondent for a couple of German media for a couple of years, and now I mostly write books about China. The last one is which was published in May. Is called The Dirty Silk Road, which covers basically the Chinese investments all over the world, which actually has a 10-year anniversary just yesterday. So yesterday was actually a day when Xi Jinping 10 years ago announced the new Silk Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, as it is called as well.
So, how does one become a Chinese journalist? What was your inspiration to kind of go down that rabbit hole? It's a kind of unique and interesting career to choose for oneself, right?
That's a good question, and I have a kind of like funny answer to that. If
Good,
you
I
asked
love
me like
fun.
15 years ago, would you ever go to China? I was like, no, no way, never China. It's a dictatorship. I never want to go there. Blah. Um, but it was around 2008. I had a I had a girlfriend who was born in China.
Mhm.
She's German. I grew up in Germany, but has Chinese roots, and actually she was the first one where I traveled with her to China, and then I got a very mixed image, or very mixed impression of this really huge and very diverse country. And then I think 2011, I just moved to Shanghai and then started as a freelance journalist. And after a while, I got hired by a major business publication. And yeah, and since then, basically, my work and my interest is always like somehow around China.
Not very interesting. So, you kind of highlighted it a little bit earlier, the new Silk Road, as Xi Jinping calls it. If you could elaborate on that a little bit, what is Xi's vision for this new Silk Road that he started putting out there 10 or so years ago?
I would say like maybe like the how do you call it, the smallest denominator of it is it's the first geopolitical or geostrategical project of China where Beijing wants to project power and project influence all over the world. Okay,
Hmm.
how do they do that? It's quite simple. It's actually China has a huge amount of foreign currency reserves, mainly US dollars. They
Hmm.
basically saved that from the 1990s on, and so they since in 2013 they started giving out loans to mostly countries in the global south. And with these loans, these countries could build like big infrastructure projects like roads, airports, ports, pipelines, and stuff like that. Um, there was one condition: the contract to build the project was given to a Chinese state-owned company. So they would go to, let's say, Sri Lanka or Kenya and build a railroad. And then, in a perfect world, this project would stimulate GDP and basically would create like a surplus, like a profit, and so the country would pay back the loan, and China would have increased its influence, and everybody would be happy, right? So this is like
Yep.
the win-win strategy, how China propagates the Belt and Road Initiative, or AKA the New Silk Road, right?
Hmm.
If you go more into detail, then you find a lot of things don't work out as planned, and sometimes it's a win-lose, and sometimes it's even a lose-lose scenario. But basically, that's like the concept. Like China or Beijing was giving out loans to countries. Some of them are even Western countries, but I would say like the majority of it are poorer countries in the global South. Give them a loan, build an infrastructure project, maybe at some point pay the money back, and everybody would be happy.
Also, At its core, if you take that at face value, it sounds like a very good. I mean, it sounds like interesting and for the good of, I don't know if you want to call it all humanity, procedure to help what is the disenfranchised emerging markets in the global south, right? I mean, these are countries that don't necessarily have the financial backing internally or even in the regions that they domicile to build these infrastructure projects to exist in a global macro economy, which is largely Western dominated. You have to have that level of infrastructure to be able to attract capital from China,
Absolutely.
from the United States, from Europe, from Japan, etc.
Mhm.
If you don't have an airport, if you don't have bridges, if you don't have basic security infrastructure, if you don't have traditional regulatory infrastructure that the West is maybe more confident in, you're never going to be able to attract capital to these areas, right? So, okay, China steps up, says, we're going to take the risk. We're going to go to these jurisdictions. We're going to bankroll them. And if it works out exactly like you said, great. We get our money back. We have influence there. We did them a favor to a certain extent. I mean, they've now been able to build infrastructure where they can now participate in a global economy, but that's only at face value. And like you said, more often than not, this ends up in a win-lose or a lose-lose situations. So what are the situations that generally unfurl with this, what looks like an on the face, overall good idea?
I think you summed it up pretty well, and it's also like while I was doing my research and working in these countries, I had to ask at some point. I had to ask myself the questions: okay, what actually is bad about it? Because there are some bad examples. I just gonna tell one, but there are some good examples, and then you start asking questions. Okay, like why, are we maybe in the West a little bit obsessed with the new Chinese power? We can discuss this later. But I tell you, like, maybe the most famous or infamous bad example of what happened. For example, in Sri Lanka, it's a small island in the south of India.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sri Lanka wanted to build a port, a new port. There was some demand for a new port, not like huge, but some people said like, okay, the infrastructure in the capital Colombo is too small. We need a new port, right? So China gave it a loan. It was about 250 million to build a port about 200 kilometers south of the capital. It's called Hambantota. And the port was built. But then around 2015, 2000, I think it was 2015, Sri Lanka got problems to paying back its debt. I mean, you have to know that Sri Lanka is a country which has like a bad history of insolvencies. They have had, had problems with like this for many years again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened was like they basically negotiated loan, and the result was they leased the port for 99 years to Beijing. So what happened basically was basically a sell off of infrastructure, right, of state territory to China. And okay, so this happened, and this is like the most infamous example of the new Silk Road, and that like shaped the term debt trap diplomacy. So that like implies that China would like push smaller countries deliberately into debt, and then like seize some of the property of this country and like just expand their own power. I mean, if you get a little bit into like it's a I would say it's a spectrum, and you have Sri Lanka is like really
Mm-hmm.
on the negative side, and then it moves slowly on to other categories. But I think what you can say in general is that all the countries, or not all the countries, but a majority of the countries who received money from China have debt problems at the moment. They haven't seized state property yet, but they all are in problems, and they have to negotiate with China. And China will demand something at least for, I don't know, debt jubilee or something, or a negotiation of the debt. This is one thing that definitely happened. And then another problem is that the closer look at the details of these projects, you find out there was a lot of corruption involved. Usually the companies did not pay any attention to environmental standards or labor rights of the country. All the workers I talked to, all the people who were directly affected around the project were like basically complaining that either their livelihood was destroyed because they couldn't go on with their jobs, or they just had very bad experiences with these projects. So, but it's interesting what you mentioned. I mean, of course, you have a big demand in countries of the global south for infrastructure and for getting loans.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk to these people there, like a lot of people are telling you that actually they feel either neglected or like don't like Western institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, and they basically appreciate the fact that suddenly there's a new moneylender in town, right? So it's not only the West, it's not only US, it's not only the World Bank who gives them money, it's also they also can get money from China. So I think that's one reason why the Silk Road is like so-called efficient or effective, because there's a demand for it in these countries. And this made me really think when I was doing my research, because I thought like, okay, like maybe this should be a little bit of like a kind of a wake up call for Western institutions as well, because something is going wrong. Otherwise, an authoritarian state wouldn't be so successful with giving out money.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you frame it that way. That China largely, and maybe, I mean, I would like to think that maybe there's an element of ambition that they're doing this purely from a good faith financial perspective. I'm sure that's baked in there in a certain regard, but largely you would probably argue that this is done so China can really just expand its influence throughout the global south, expand, and therefore expanding its global influence kind of through the back door that the West largely avoids. And what was interesting to me, I mean, so when I did my MBA program at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management many years ago, and that program, we had about 50 students together. And I think we had about 30 something countries represented in those 50 students, the bulk of which, I think the majority came from India and China, like 4 or 5 each. We had 3 Americans, and then everything else was just a mix of everything. And naturally, you can understand that whenever we started talking global macro policy, things started to get a little contentious in those conversations, right? Now, one of the things that was interesting to me is when we actually had, and this is 6-7 years ago, conversations around this and China expanding its financial influence throughout the world, I brought up the point that, I kind of believe largely that China is doing this solely so that they might be able to expand their military power, their military presence over time. And that I felt as an American that is a bad thing, just because generally speaking, I mean, I'm obviously going to admit my severe bias to this, but if I'm going to live in a world where there is a global superpower, I would rather that global superpower hold Western cultural ideals than Chinese communist ideals. And that's not saying the US is perfect. Naturally, the US has committed atrocities the world over. But I would rather have the ideals that America stands for upholding global order, more so, not necessarily America itself, I'm not saying that, but the ideals that America stands for upholding global order over the ideals of China. And what was interesting to me, and I mean, I'd never really been out of the country, even so much at that point, but what was pointed out to me by a lot of the Asian students, a lot of the Indian, a lot of the Chinese students was like, well, you realize China is just copy and pasting the American playbook from the post World War II era, right? And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? They were like, well, okay, fine. You look at the Marshall Plan, what they did with Germany, that's one thing in of itself. Take that, that was kind of a unique situation, leave that in a vacuum. But if you look at what the US did in the years, especially as the Cold War was ramping up, they would provide loans for infrastructure to anybody that was willing to accept it, because the US was just an economic powerhouse on a scale that it's not even on today relative to the rest of the world back then, right? So it was providing all of these loans. And then whenever those loans defaulted, America had this wonderful idea. Oh, you know what? We'll forgive your loan, but you got to let us have a military base right in your doorstep, right? And that's why America, I think, has like what, over 100 military bases around the world that are not even on American soil. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, well, you know what? It's awfully hypocritical of me to kind of find fault with what China is effectively doing there. I mean, granted, I fundamentally believe I oppose it because I don't want to see Chinese influence, or rather the ideals of Chinese influence being spread throughout the world tied to communism. But I'm not going to fault them too much for taking a similar approach to what America has done historically over the last 70, 80 years, right?
Well, I think everything you just said, I completely agree with, and also I think you summed up the whole all the problems up very well. I mean, after like doing the research in my book, I can understand many perspectives, you know, and I think there is this perspective you just was describing that a lot of people, especially like in Asia and Africa with the colonial past, they have this feeling, look, like you guys did the same, and now it's the Chinese. So what's the problem? What do you want from us?
Right.
Um, and from a I don't know, from an Indian or a Kenyan or some other African country perspective, I can see what they mean. I can understand it, you know, because there are a lot of bad things colonial powers did in these countries. And what the Chinese is doing at the moment, it doesn't seem so bad, like compared to other things like the British or the French did in Africa. Because
What's interesting is what China seems to be doing abroad looks so much better on the surface. And it might be superficial, I don't know, but it looks so much better on the surface than what China is allegedly doing internally within its own borders, right? And that's what concerns me. Do we
yeah,
potentially see the Chinese surveillance state that they have, that they've effectively built out internally? I mean, do we see a risk of this being the way that China eventually expands that outside of its borders?
yeah. I mean, just going back to what you mentioned before, I also think there is a big difference in Chinese influence and Western influence, because it's just like you
Mm-hmm.
said, you know, I think China or the Communist Party of China doesn't have any universal values that protect individual rights or something. You know, I mean, it's basically, of course, there are Marxist-Leninist ideology, and you somehow could argue that there is there are some universal aspects in this ideology, but I don't really see it. You know, I think for me it's more like a collectivistic society which serves the one party state. So I completely agree with you that there is a fundamental difference between um, a country that pursues universal rights for every individual on the planet and another country that just tries to get more powerful. You know? And the other thing is, like, of course, China is quite successful with selling their so-called developmental development program to the world. Because basically, what I mean, their USP is, look, you can be an authoritarian government and you can have huge GDP growth. You know, and this is something I think for many corrupt and autocratic leaders, this is it's quite appealing, right? Because usually it means like either you're a tyrant and authoritarian ruler, but then you're not like admired by the rest of the world for your amazing economy and great GDP growth,
It's
or you're a
interesting because
democracy.
China seems to be the first that really accomplished that, at
Yeah,
least in modern history, right? Like there's been monarchies, there's been tyrannical dictatorships before in medieval history that have realized massive economic growth, largely because the world, frankly, was much smaller back then. China's somehow been able to do it on a modern scale. I mean, what are your thoughts on why that model, or what is so special about that Chinese model that mixes totalitarian, authoritarian governmental structure with a relative free market economy? I mean, I don't want to necessarily call it a free market economy, but it's crony capitalism to a
yeah.
certain extent. I mean, how has that been able to be so successful for them?
Good question. I mean, I think what they definitely did, what the Communist Party did. I mean, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, they took immense time and energy to study exactly why the Soviet system has failed, and they really tried to learn from it. And I think they did this in a very successful way. Um, and then there's another thing where some people argue that, like, the conclusion basically was that, okay, the Soviet system failed because it didn't have a market economy. Why? Like, why did it fail? Because of that. Because a market usually is the best system to to process information. Yeah? So
Hmm.
planned economy, you had huge how do you call it in English, like failed plannings, right? You produce too many pencils because somebody said like, hey, we need no pencils, so they produced 3 billion pencils, and then this other resources were missing at another point, so
That
it's
sounds a lot like
something
the problem the U.S. has with its military right now.
yeah, probably. Yeah, it's about whenever.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's the problem of central planning, right? You don't
exactly.
central planning. You don't have enough information to do it in the best possible way. You say like, okay, a market is a much better mechanism to process the information and then distribute it. And some people argue that the Communist Party is actually about to replace the market mechanism by surveillance and algorithms. That like you that like now surveillance cameras like process so much information, and algorithms like do actually a better job than the market. But it's a little bit far-fetched, but I think it's something what I think some people in the CCP believe, that they think like, okay, maybe we can be successful without a market mechanism. This is
Hmm.
one thing. And then on another note, or another side aspect, definitely is that, I mean, I think central planned economies can be very successful in a short time. If you take a look at the Soviet Union in the late 20s or early 30s, I mean, it was like the rapidly industrializing. I know from,
Hmm.
at least from Germany, there were some people traveling to Soviet Union, and then coming back and say, wow, this is amazing. Look, what Stalin doing is so great. He built so many factories. Everything is so successful. And I think in a very short time it was, because like you can, like, if you that's an advantage of central planning, right? Somebody like hits the bottom or gives out an order, and then everybody goes out and does it, right?
Also, it's interesting that you draw that parallel because almost every study that's ever been done around what makes a very early stage startup successful. I mean, okay, bake in the elements of having a good idea, having financing, being in the right jurisdiction, regulatory, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those are all contributing factors. But the number one factor that most studies find is that you have an authoritarian dictator like CEO that basically powers through one singular vision rather than having this collective group of individuals subject to groupthink. That the idea of having that one individualistic idea that's executed on is better in that short term. And obviously, that's not a startup that scales. Eventually, you have to grow out an organization, you have to delegate. Every organization goes through that. But it's the exact same thing that happens in business, I think, to a certain extent.
Absolutely. I think basically we're talking about the advantages and disadvantages of centralized and decentralized systems. And I think a centralized system can have some advantages, definitely in the short run, but I think in the long run, it's always like decentralized structures um, are superior, because they can quicker react to a changed environment. And you can see what's happening now in China. I mean, the real estate crisis is maybe, I think the dangers are sometimes a little bit overblown in the West, but one could argue that the China growth model is maybe coming to an end now.
So it's interesting that you say that because for how many people, especially in the West, and obviously the West has its own bias, the West has its own agenda, and they have their own anti Chinese propaganda that they largely propagate, right? And you know what? A lot of people say, like, okay, China's relatively healthy, but largely in the West, there's this sentiment that, okay, China's time, it's on a short leash, right? Everything that they've been doing is on the precipice of collapsing. It's probably going to happen over the course of the next decade, even. But then you have others that look at this and go, oh no, I mean, China is continuing to accelerate growth. Sure, they're knocking down a couple of extra buildings that they ended up not needing, but factually, they are as strong and as successful as an economy as they've envisioned themselves being. There is no lie there. They truly are that strong. I mean, what's your perception, being somebody that seems to have more intimate knowledge and maybe perhaps less biased knowledge as to what's happening with China? I mean, do you see a collapse of what their system is? Do you think it'll maintain itself? Do you think, maybe even more interesting question, uh, you've kind of already said that you think that that highly centralized planning model won't work in the long term. What is the adjustment maybe that China has to make to maintain their level of success?
Mm-hmm.
Is there an adjustment that needs to be made, or maybe is it just going to be successful as it is?
I mean, maybe you're aware of this term, the middle income trap. It's a very standard
Right.
economic
Yeah.
term, right? I think that's somehow very adequate for China, because like they really made a jump from an so-called third world country to a middle income country, and I myself witnessed the changes, and it's really, it's breathtaking. It's amazing, and especially when you talk to normal people, like people in, let's say, over 40, who the life they live in at least in the big cities in the East Coast, it's not so much different from our life in the West. Pretty similar, actually. Some are even richer than us, you know. And but when you talk to these people and ask them about their childhood, like most of them say, like, yeah, I know how hunger feels. You know, I know they always have the same had get this answer so many times. Was like, yeah, when I was a kid, we had rice and vegetables, and many days we had only rice, no vegetables. You know, and then they always said like, yeah, no, we have meat every day, and so and it's really like a first-hand experience that like millions, hundreds of millions of people in China have, you know, that their life now is much better than their lives in the childhood, you know. And this is something like that has become very rare in Western Europe and in the US, you know. And ask people in our age, like, was your life better during your childhood? You like, well, maybe same, maybe a little bit better, but you don't say like, wow, yeah, I know what how hunger feels like. No, none of us is saying that, right? We have a kind. For us, the overall feeling is more like, yeah, everything is a little bit in decline, and everything is like getting, I don't know, downhill, or at least it's not getting better, right? So, and I think this mentality of the Chinese people, that this experience that everything has gotten better in the last 20 or 30 years, that like gives the whole system like a kind of fuel, you know. That's kind of the fuel for the engine, for the Chinese engine to be positive, to go on and not to criticize too much. I mean, there's a lot of surveillance in China, of course, and very harsh penalties for dissidents and stuff like that. But I would say still, like, I think 90% of the people are kind of okay with what's going on, you know. And I think
So it's interesting that you frame it that way, because, I mean, if you think about what China has been able to accomplish, and let's think about this in the term of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? China has basically, and I forget exactly what the levels are, but China has effectively perfected layer one and maybe layer two. They have offered their citizens, at least certain citizens, we can have a conversation about the Uyghur Muslims, but they've offered the vast majority of their citizens that absolute perfected security blanket. Basically, almost everyone's base needs are taken care of. And I mean, the COVID pandemic and their response to that, and basically locking people in their apartments for months on end aside, generally speaking, in how Chinese civilization is supposed to work, those base needs are effectively covered. But they don't offer anything that allows for achieving human accomplishment or uh, enlightenment, right?
I think
They don't allow, the purpose is, as is the purpose of every communist type society, get up, go to work, your base needs are covered, you don't have to ask any questions because the government is there to make sure you're going to have food on the table and you're going to lead a life. But there's no real individualism tied in that type of society. So while you get that first level of Maslow's needs covered, you're never going to be able to achieve those additional layers on top. And I like, that's what I fundamentally hate, because I'm a person who believes, okay, the government has to create a certain infrastructure that enables those base layers, that as long as you make the right choices, as long as you have educated yourself and have worked hard, you have the right to have those base levels of the hierarchy protected. And that's kind of where, I mean, so astutely put, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, right? Okay, you don't get those as rights. Nobody has the right to life. Nobody has the right to happiness, but you have the right to pursue it. The only way to do that is you don't actually have the base level guaranteed. You have to actually work. You have to have a work ethic. You have to educate. You have to be educated. And only then will you have that base Maslow hierarchy of security covered. From there, you then are enabled to escalate your understanding, become more educated. You can be ambitious and try to better yourself, better those around you. And that's, I think, what the whole Chinese model, as opposed to the American model, is missing. Whereas China guarantees the base layer, but you're never going to get to the higher levels of needs. But the American system doesn't guarantee the base level, but it offers the opportunity to guarantee that you are going to have that covered and to progress through the hierarchy of needs.
Very, very interesting thought. I never seen it that way, but yeah, it makes sense to me. I would say some people
Good,
don't.
because I wasn't sure if I was articulating it very well.
No, it's great. That the Chinese way of seeing life is like it's somebody once said like the Chinese Earth is flat, because there's no it's getting a little bit philosophical and ethical here, but he said like the Chinese world is flat because they don't there's no transcendental aspect of it, where you want to pursue, achieve something higher. The system is not built for that. The system is
Yeah.
built like like you said, you get your basic needs fulfilled and follow the party, right? So
Unless you're high up in the CCP, then you can achieve the
exactly,
whole
exactly.
thing.
And then I think also, and here we're also like coming back to universal value, because like when you say like you guarantee the basic needs for a number of people, then you can ask yourself, okay, who's eligible for that? And I think at the end it becomes and you also can feel that in the Chinese society, it becomes a very nationalistic, and it even can become racist. Like there's not in the Chinese society. I think they're very great people, very curious and very open-minded, and they're also very interested in foreigners. But there's no deeper, no real understanding that someone who doesn't look Chinese can become Chinese. There are stories of
Yeah.
people who live for 90, they live for 70 years in Beijing, but they still call the Laobai, the foreigner. It's like there's no this model cannot integrate other people, and I think this coming back to like universal values. If China expands its influence in the world, it does not deliver universal values or universal rights to other people. This model is not it's not made for that.
No, and when you see how Chinese, and I don't want to accuse the Chinese of being racist. I think it's maybe more the Chinese government. But when you see how it interacts with Western nations, Russia, relative to how it interacts with India, to Pakistan, to the Middle East, to Africa, there is a complete level of difference between how those people are treated relative to others. I mean, so I remember I've been to China a few times. So I remember a few years ago, my wife and I, so we actually had a 13, 14-hour layover in Beijing. We were on our way from Germany to the Philippines for a good friend of ours' wedding. They were having the wedding in Cebu. So we had a long layover in Beijing, and one of my college roommates, he's from China, living in Beijing, so he decided to take us out on the town. And I mean, we had an absolute wonderful time as we were going around the city. He showed us all of the sites. We went to Tiananmen Square. We went to, it's actually funny. Like when I was in Tiananmen Square, I mean, I'm not a tall guy by any means. I'm like 5'10", 5'11", probably very average height for an American. I have never felt more tall in my entire life than when I was walking around Tiananmen Square. It just felt like I was head and shoulders above everybody else. And it was funny because, I mean, my wife was there and she's this beautiful white German girl. I can't even tell you how many Chinese people came up to her asking for pictures with her, like almost as if they had never seen a white woman outside of Instagram before. So just this complete, I don't know, very different approach towards. I mean, it happened in India for my wife as well too. We were walking along a beach in India, and I swear to God, about 100 men came up just out of nowhere asking to take pictures with my wife. She felt like she was a supermodel. It was hilarious, and I had to stand there and take 100 pictures of her. But it's just interesting how that society perceives or values different races. And I don't know how that's going to play out on a global scale. Because like you said, I mean, when it comes to central planning like that, it becomes more of a like, okay, well, you have these values, you have these ideals, but who are they for? Right. I mean, the American system, and admittedly, it doesn't actually work that way sometimes. But the American system is designed that, okay, no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, you can do this, right? That's at least what the ideal is. Does America work that way? Largely, yes, but there are instances where clearly it does not.
Yeah.
Does the European model work that way? Idealistically, yes, it's absolutely supposed to. I think Europe maybe perfected that better than anywhere else on Earth. But of course, there's instances where it doesn't work that way. I don't believe that China has that level of inclusive thought built into their model.
No.
And maybe the Chinese people do. And I think we have to severely distinguish between the Chinese people and the
Yeah.
Chinese government
Thanks
itself.
for saying that, because it's really important to make this distinction. And I was kind of like say like I had extremely positive experiences with Chinese people inside China. You know, that's
Oh, I love going to China.
yeah.
I mean, I'm a Bitcoin guy, so I can't go back to China.
Yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure if I ever land in China, I'm going to get arrested immediately. But I absolutely loved any time that I spent in China. Like, I miss going to Hong Kong.
maybe
And I know Hong Kong's not China, but I mean, let's
yeah,
be honest, China kind of runs Hong Kong now.
yeah, yeah.
It's, yeah.
I mean, maybe one more aspect to understand better what China wants. You know, for China, the 19th century is like a century of humiliation, right? Where China basically lost its normal stance in the world community out of like an historic abnormality, right? So it is an interesting number. Don't pin me down on the exact numbers, but like there's statistics where you say like in 1800. 60% of the world trade had something to do with China, right? 60% of the whole world trade.
I would believe that.
Yeah, and this percentage got down in the 1950 to 6%, right? And now since like the 1990s, it climbed up, and now I think we are around the 20%. But from a Chinese perspective, like it's still like historically abnormal low, you know, like so China is they see it, at least the Chinese party sees it as a kind of a renaissance of China getting its normal place back in the world, you know. And I think that's at the end that's their program, right? To become more powerful and to make China more powerful.
So one of the things that you touched on earlier, the power of centralized systems relative to the power of decentralized systems. I mean, I understand that you're a Bitcoin and a crypto enthusiast yourself, right? I mean, where do you see these decentralized systems that crypto is theoretically supposed to be perpetuating throughout the world? I mean, are these systems that can bring perhaps the same good that China is economically and financially trying to bring to emerging markets? Do you think it has the opportunity to compete with the Chinese model? I mean, so for instance, we actually just announced today out of Samara Asset Group that we're donating $10,000 in BTC to a charity set up in Kenya. It's a wonderful woman that I recently just met, actually just on the podcast, and she's doing a educational focus for Bitcoin exclusively for women in Kenya. I mean, an absolutely incredible initiative. And obviously 10K in Bitcoin is only going to go so far. I wish I had more that we would be able to provide. But do you see that what crypto can do from unlocking the barriers to entry for capital markets for these emerging markets? Do we think that this could be something that one day competes with the Chinese model and more decentralizes what they're trying to accomplish from an infrastructure build and influence perspective throughout the global South?
To be honest, I'm a bit skeptical. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Bitcoin fan. I love the idea of Bitcoin. I think that it will bring a lot of good things. But I also really appreciate the initiatives who like try to bring the idea, especially to the people in countries in the global south. I think it's a little bit too early to really create changes on a big scale. I think at the
Mm-hmm.
moment, especially when I talk to people in Africa and Asia, I always like when I did my research trips, I always ask like, hey, can I pay you with Bitcoin, or do you know Bitcoin? Do you use it?
Yeah.
And actually, it was surprisingly little interest in Bitcoin.
Mm.
Um, I mean, unfortunately, there were a lot of like shitcoin people who were interested in shitcoin because they heard like, yeah, can get rich quick and
Everyone hears the
but
get
like
rich
not
quick
not
thing,
many
right?
people really understood the groundbreaking idea of Bitcoin. But I think on the other hand, what I realized is, for example, take Turkey. I've lived in Turkey also for years, and I really love the country. And they have a big inflation problem, and
Mm-hmm.
also Bitcoin acceptance is also very high in Turkey. Why? Because like Turkey is like a traditional gold country, like Sri Lanka, for example, as well. Like people are used that governments fail. They're used that currencies fail and tend to be zero at some end. So what they do is like they like historically they save in gold, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think the big advantage of Bitcoin is it has the potential to become digital gold. And in my experience, like people in these countries, they pick up the idea much quicker than in the West. In Germany, like you have to explain a long time. Ask you, why should I buy gold? Why? Also, yeah, because inflation and the euro is like debased. Is getting debased in the long term. And they're like, really?
Yeah.
I never heard about that. Really? But if you say something like this in Turkey, then people like immediately get it. It's like, oh yeah, oh, interesting. Yeah, of course, it's something to protect our.
Maybe you know this statistic. I personally don't off the top of my head, but like for instance, the U.S. dollar ever since the 1930s or so has roughly lost about 95% of its purchasing power, basically in almost 100 years. So okay, fine, over 100, like in a singular lifetime, when you have enough money to make that matter, generally speaking, that's not going to impact you too much. I mean, it's crazy. Here in the US, we started bitching and complaining about high single digit inflation numbers as if that's a bad thing. And granted, it is a bad thing, but you compare that to the rest of the world and it's nothing, right? I mean, how much purchasing power parity has the euro lost since its inception? I mean, that came about in what? The 80s, 90s, something like
Happens a
that?
bit later, but like in 2000 actually, like it was
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Like 2000 was really like introduced on an everyday basic basis that you really could pay with it. Yeah.
And how much purchasing power? I mean, how much has it maintained over that period of time? Is it 90%? Is it 80%? I mean, has anybody ever looked at that number? Because usually everyone just looks at the dollar and says, oh,
No,
yeah, it's lost everything.
I can tell you one thing. Like it's a very simple statistic, but in Munich, in Germany, we have the beer fest, and I remember when I was a I don't know 18-year teenager, or first time I went to Oktoberfest, I think a Mass, which is like a liter of beer.
Oh, ich liebe Maß.
Yeah, and it was like a bet less than 10 Deutschmarks, right? And 10 Deutschmarks is €5.
Okay.
And I think a mass price, just let me Google that. What is it this year? I think it will be, just give me a second. I really want to Google that now. Oh, yeah. This year it will be 12 to €15. So
Okay. So
that would make
if
it
we just
30
exclusively price
Deutschmarks.
beer,
It would be like three times as much.
yeah, that's absolutely insane. Hey, Veronica, we're actually just finishing another recording. We have Veronica joining us in about 10 minutes or so. I mean, Veronica, you can just sit there tight. We'll just have that edited out. It's fine. I'm not sure if she can hear us. Well, so then anyway, Philip, it sounds as though we basically have what 50 at least, maybe 60 to 70% reduction
Yeah,
in
probably.
the euro value. Uh, Veronica, can you jump off? Perfect.
Okay.
Uh, we'll just edit that out in post. That's fine. Yeah, we have heard she's supposed to be joining at 10. I guess she decided to come on and test the link early. Yeah. So okay, we have. I mean, so the euro is basically then lost, at least in beer, which is what the probably number one consumed item in Germany. The
Yeah,
euro has lost
it's actually a pretty
60 to 70% of its
good
purchasing
measure.
power.
Yeah, because people drink beer all the time, and then the Oktoberfest is a stable institution in Munich, Germany. So yeah, it's a good measure.
I mean, so that's interesting. So, I mean, basically, we can say that the euro is on a path that over the next 20 years, it's nearly at a value of zero. I mean, because if you compound 60, 70% twice over a 40-year period, the euro has now existed for roughly 20 years. I mean, I don't know the math exactly off the top of my head, but 70% of 70, you're now looking at, okay, it's like 85% of its total value is now lost. It only maintained 50% of its purchasing power over the course of 40 years. And people don't necessarily, I mean, that's a course of a lifetime. That is the course of an adult lifetime, even a short lifetime. I mean, by the time that you're in the workforce and you're working, you're earning your cash 20 to 30, 40, 50. Everything that you've earned and saved up over those first years is now effectively worth 15% of the value it has from when you earned it by the time you're retiring.
Yeah.
That is horrifying if you're a German, especially because Germany has like what, one of the top savings rates in the world. I mean, Germans don't typically invest that much money. Germans, I mean, my wife, I remember she was furious with me when she found out that I had a 401k plan from my former years at PwC. And God forbid I had my money in the stock market. Don't you know you're always going to lose your money in the stock market, right? She's a typical German. She would much rather put the money under the mattress and just let it sit there forever,
Yeah.
right? Or put it in gold, which is a very fine investment, right? But it's interesting though, because you contrast that with which country has the highest pro rata ownership of Bitcoin or the highest percentage ownership of Bitcoin. It's Germany.
Okay.
It's
Oh, that's interesting.
it's number one in the world.
Well,
It's higher than the U.S. It's, I mean, granted, it's not the most Bitcoin owned. I mean, the United States and China, they still dominate those statistics, but the highest percentage of people that own Bitcoin is in Germany. And I think similar to Turkey, because of, let's call it, Germany's unfortunate history over the last 100 or so years, people understand the value of that gold. People understand the value of storing it because of, I mean, the Weimar Republic and everything that happened in the post-war era.
uh, yeah, maybe sometimes I'm not sure if maybe it's too long ago, but of course I still heard these stories from my mom, who was telling the stories of her grandma, but it's like it's somehow like it's fading out in the collective consciousness. I think another reason Germany is just more a little bit like tech savvy, that people are
Yeah.
more, I don't know, they have enough time to dive into these rabbit holes or something like that. Yeah.
And they also have disposable income, right?
Yes.
Not the most disposable income, but it is a Western modern society
Yeah.
that doesn't have the same levels as the United States does. But Germans still have the mentality of, okay, I have a little bit of, I think I remember it's like what, $130, $140 the average German has in monthly excess disposable income,
Okay.
like
Yeah.
after,
Sounds
yeah,
realistic.
something like that. And they put it into savings every single time. You put that into Bitcoin, you're stockpiling a good amount of Satoshis over the course of a lifetime. Philip, it has been wonderful to have you on. I think we're going to have to invite you back at some point because I really want to dive a little bit more down the Bitcoin and the crypto rabbit hole with you. Maybe just kind of one final question. What do you think is one of the things we should look out for from a Chinese policy perspective that, or, I mean, maybe just over the course of the coming years? I mean, maybe more even pointed. What are your thoughts on BRICS as a competing currency to the U.S. dollar from a global reserve currency? This obviously being the initiative led largely by Brazil, China, and Russia, but predominantly China, I would argue.
I think you should never forget that like it's an let's say like a public aim or target of the Chinese policy to de-dollarize, or to have a multipolar currency system.
Hmm.
they're pursuing this. But I think what is different in China, and what is probably an advantage of them, is like um, they really think long term. They don't need to jump on. I mean, you know, the BRICS meeting in August. Like there were a lot of rumors about that. Well, they're gonna announce the new BRICS currency, but nothing happened. I think
Right.
the CCP is very good with like historical thinking, and they will just wait until the right window of opportunity opens, and then they will do it. So they're not driven by election cycles, and I think at the end they were just very
Oh, but
rational
it's the
players.
People's Democratic Republic of China. Didn't anybody tell you that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, interesting. I'm interested to see what comes out of BRICS. I mean, even
Definitely,
as
it's
an
gonna be an
American,
interesting thing to watch. Definitely, yeah.
yeah. I mean, even as an American, like, okay, fine. I'm going to be personally hurt by the de-dollarization, but I think, I mean, we're going to have you back on to have a specific conversation around this because I have a lot of thoughts on A, why the dollar should not be the global reserve currency, and B, what is currently happening as to why the dollar within a 10, let's call it 25-year cycle, will no longer be the global reserve currency. But anyway, Philip, it was wonderful to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Pat. Thanks for having me.
Have
It
a
was
great one.
really cool conversation.